I'm here first time. I hope it's not my last time. I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I will speak about European crisis with emphasis on the capitalism, which is capitalism with European characteristics. Writing for the London Review of Books in 2007, Perry Anderson wrote that the emergence of the European Union may be regarded as the last great world historical achievement of the bourgeoisie, proof that its creative powers were not exhausted by the fratricide of two world wars. Just a year later, the outbreak of financial crisis, which soon flooded Europe, revealed the true character of the European half-century achievement, the project called the European Dream. Well, today, the streets of the European Dream are covered with marches of hundreds of thousands of disgruntled, dispossessed, or disfranchised workers, requiring a fundamental change of the economic model that has pushed them into existential misery. We are also witnessing that in the heart of the European Union is not prosperity for all its citizens, but also for selected social classes, the ones that insatiably accumulate wealth at the expense of the rest of the population. We observe the political place in which non-elected prime ministers, as in the case of Italy and Greece, are given the halo of national saviors, although they only protect the interests of financial capital. But, despite everything, masks are slowly falling from their faces, and it becomes apparent that in the heart of the European Union was always an existing class antagonism between the capitalists and the working class. And by this, I don't mean working class as the manual workers, but all those who are forced to sell their labor to survive. Workers in the shops, cleaners, nurses, tradesmen, school teachers, nurses in the kindergarten, and the rest of the service sector. Lives of the working class has become particularly threatened and insecure in the peripheral countries of the European Union. The escalating financial crisis, virtually bankrupt European banks, and the fiscal collapse of Greece fully revealed deeply divided economic structure of the European Union and politically unsustainable design of the euro area. We can no longer ignore that the Central European countries, as Germany, France, Great Britain, or Benelux countries, have concentrated industrial and financial power with which economic elites achieve trade surpluses. On the other hand, on the other side are less developed countries on the periphery, countries of Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, that serve exclusively as markets for product placement of the center, thereby generating trade deficits. Intermediaries in the creation of these colonial mechanisms are primarily German and French banks. Specifically, German banks lend money to Greece, and Greece uses this money to buy products from Germany. When the crisis outburst, a common currency area became a straitjacket for the countries included in the Eurozone. These countries do not have their own currency which they could devalue, and thus enhance competitiveness. And this continuation of the euro flow from the German, French and Italian banks, which are actually bankrupt, emphasized the burden of accumulated debts simply because they are short of money for its servicing. But political and media presentation of the crisis in the European Union has manifested deliberate discourse of completely different interpretation. They utterly ignored the uncomfortable relationship between the colonial center and periphery, and placed focus on racist myths of inherently corrupt periphery and lazy Mediterranean. With this media designed scenery for a political response to the crisis. After the breakdown of debt, Greece was first to take a hit from European banksters. The people of Greece became a guinea pig in a sadistic laboratory of European elites, The brutal austerity measures have destroyed what Yanis Varoufakis calls social economy. He means everyday social life and financial exchanges. Broad layers of the population found themselves in a situation of poverty and existential misery, where many people take their lives out of despair. The number of suicides since the outbreak of the crisis has increased by 40% in Greece. Heroin addiction and prostitution has spread, and because of drastic cost cutting to the health service, once extinct disease malaria appeared again. In some areas it's becoming an endemic disease. In 2 years, Greece turned into a third world country. In return for implementing harsh austerity measures, Greece received 2 bailouts from the European Central Bank, International Monetary Fund and European Commission, institutions colloquially called Troika. But that money is not intended to encourage Greek economy, but is immediately forwarded to the accounts of German and French banks under the further obligation to conduct more rigorous austerity measures. Thus, Greece received the worst of both worlds, the political and economic subordination to the European bankers and destructive austerity measures. Richard Seymour wrote that the new measures reek of ruthlessness born out of despair. Well, Greece is not the only country which implemented austerity measures, but their content was the most brutal. In the process of implementing these measures, which the European elites dictate to protect their wealth, any resemblance of democracy has been rejected. In Greece and Italy, the elected prime ministers have been replaced by banking technocrats. There is only question remain: how long will the nations in the European Union put up with such developments? The highest political echelon, disintegrated from any contact with reality, is convinced that the current situation can go indefinitely. So they decided to codify these measures, which have so far been conducted only on a national level, on the EU level, in the form of the Agreement on Fiscal Stability. All countries so far, except Great Britain and Czech Republic, have signed this agreement. This agreement on fiscal stability, which would enter into force on January 1st, 2013, is not only codification of fiscal rules at European level, such as the provision that the annual structural deficits must not exceed 0.5% of nominal GDP, which is actually impossible for any peripheral country of the European Union. This agreement in fact means the subordination of the economic policies of each member country to unelected bureaucrats in the European institutions, who will monitor, like European Commission, and sanction, like European Court of Justice, violator countries. Each member country will also have to change the constitutions, bringing provisions from the Treaty on Fiscal Stability. In reality, it will be a codification of the colonial relationship between center and periphery, and an attempt to consolidate European capitalist class. In the event that this contract really comes to life, the European monetary and fiscal policy will finally be united by an extremely violent mechanism. Banking circles will become untouchable. With the banks what banks have not taken, they will. The banks who have they not hurt, they will. When is the only questions. The Greek, Spaniards, Portuguese, and Italians are first up. Soon the French, Germans, British, Americans, and Canadians will feel the pain of a country under bank control. Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis calls this scenario European disaster, an unavoidable road to the postmodern 30s. Together with the British politician Stuart Holland, he developed a Keynesian draft called Modest Proposal in response to a European crisis. It is a three-step plan for reorganization of existing European institutions to combat the crisis. In the first steps, they would So they would centralize public debt for the European Central Bank. In the second step, they would encourage aggregate demand and reduce trade imbalances through public investment with the assistance of European Investment Bank. And in the third step, they would recapitalize bankrupt banks and unify banking sector. So the banks are supervised at European level and not national, as is the case now, though they operate throughout the Europe. Implementations of these measures should be the basis for cutting the Gordian knot of the European crisis. Although Keynesian proposal for resolving the crisis may seem feasible, Michael Roberts, from the Marxist perspective, is warning for the problem of falling profit rates in Europe. He states that the existing profit rates cannot grow if the area for investment is fully utilized, regardless whether the program for resolving the crisis is austerity or Keynesian plan. Therefore, successful implementation of any Keynesian plan can only work if there will be new productive spheres. What Roberts does not write, but is implicated, is the omnipresent specter that the creation of new productive spheres cannot only be realized for their creations, but also for the destruction of existing ones. Just as the Second World War resolved the crisis of capitalism in the 30s, the shadow of a new global conflict is increasingly becoming a dangerous and real possibility. European capitalist elites so far are expanding productive spheres through privatization of public goods and public services, but these spheres are still limited, even if in the meantime popular rebellion does not occur. The recent first round of presidential elections in France does not give much optimism for making the new left alternative. But the worst what can happen to left is surrendering to defeatism, apathy, or escape into depression. The strongest ammunition that the political, economic elites have over us is not a threat of police brutality, but our silence. Therefore, with every march, protest, or action, we must break our passivity and emphasize our opposition, build solidarity and unity, and denounce the ruling class as a privileged class, with whom we share nothing in common and against who we are organizing. We must not let that their well-established manipulation apparatus tear threads that bind us to the uncertain everyday life and fair future prospects. It is necessary to break the heavy milestone of isolation of mind from the existential misery of the body. This can be achieved only by constant activity, relentless writing, publishing, and discussions. Must always emphasize that the first and fundamental identification of the mind must be with the material conditions of our existence. Our conscience cannot exert irreparable skepticism, but steadfast spirit, confident in the ability to change the world. On the way of organized resistant movements and progressive initiatives, the left has to reclaim the political spheres, take back what has always been social, collective, and ours, give back to the people a voice that has a striking resonance. The work that we have to invest as leftists seems colossal, but it is the only alternative. Each defeat that will happen on this road will be a bitter test of our commitment, such that we will never give up until the final victory. Thank you.
Thank you, Domagoj. Are there any questions, commentaries? So yeah, another option is that we first have the lecture.
Yeah.
And then, okay. So,
you already know this guy.
So, Mislav Žitko is a
Mislav Žitko is mentally unstable.
Okay, I would like to thank my good friend Primož for inviting me, and Lydia, of course, for supporting Primož in this decision. Okay, you probably read the program, so you know that I'm going to talk about financial liberalization and export-led growth strategy. I want to start with a few comments about the period of prosperity, or better to say, the period of elusive prosperity, that is the pre-crisis period. Of course, our topic, or our aim, is to say something about the current crisis and possible exit strategy for the left. It is true that when one looks at the post-socialist or Eastern European countries, the group of transition economies, whatever you want to call them, one is likely to find a variety of ways in which these countries are experiencing the ongoing economic and political turmoil. Indeed, while some countries have been struck rather hard, there are examples of others that went only through a mild recession. So for any given country, there are a number of political and economic factors that need to be taken into account. So notwithstanding the complexity of the situation, I think it is possible to extrapolate some common sources of vulnerabilities for these countries, the post-socialist region, which is in one way or another, these vulnerabilities are reducing their capacity to pursue or implement a set of radical social programs. Well, what are these vulnerabilities? First of all, there are macroeconomic imbalances in the current account, which are related to the rise of private and public debt. There are institutional deficiencies, with central banking being the most obvious example, I think. And last but not least, there is an unaccountable, democratically unaccountable political structure that completely imposes its own values on the budget and public finances. Now, the transition period started with some narratives, some stories about the benefits of economic and financial liberalization. The particular importance was given to the foreign direct investment. I actually read a book recently that started, in the beginning there was the foreign direct investment, and Eastern European earth was without form and a void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the entrepreneurial spirit moved upon the face of the waters. And the IMF said, let there be a standby arrangement. And there was light. Of course, I'm joking, but I'm really close to getting it right. Now, the orthodox discourse claimed that there would be some spillover effects of the foreign direct investment that would benefit the host country, ranging from technology transfer and increases in competition to the growth in human capital. What had happened, in fact, was that a large portion of the foreign capital entered Eastern Europe, either in the form of portfolio investment or with the intention of taking hold of some of the developed and profitable sectors, such as telecommunications or the banking sector. Now, the change in the ownership structure of the banking sector is consistent with the narrative that foreign ownership of banks will bring new technology, know-how, and large pools of capital, which will in turn enhance competition, reduce interest rates, and increase, at the end, the level of economic welfare. Now, between 1995 and 2001, the ownership of the banking sector changed significantly in almost all of the post-socialist countries, with around 80% and up to 95% of banking assets were in foreign ownership at the end of 2001. Historically, this trajectory can be traced back to the introduction of the single banking license in 1989, and is a part of a wider process of financial integration in Europe, which was, of course, intensified 10 years later with the introduction of euro as a common currency. It is not surprising then that the period of elusive prosperity in Eastern European countries was actually defined by large capital inflows. Now, after the privatization of state-owned banks, after it had been completed, the newly established subsidiaries could now tap international interbank markets or take loans from the parent banks. As a consequence, cross-border loans doubled in volume, and in some cases, like Croatia, but also Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, they even tripled. Of course, as the CEPR report shows, just before the outburst of the crisis, the percentage of foreign assets in total assets of the major banks was exceptionally high. 82% for Deutsche Bank, 64% for Santander, 62% for Unicredit, and 41% for BNP Paribas. So in effect, these inflows enabled the rapid growth of private and, to a lesser extent, public debt. As in the case of the periphery of Eurozone, the credit expansion triggered the increase in imports even further. Many of the post-socialist countries have been struggling with the current account imbalances since the beginning of the transition period. But since 2000, the deficits widened substantially, leading to ever increasing exposure to the international financial markets, especially for these countries through the rise of the external debt. The privatization of the banking sector in the post-socialist countries is a part of the movement towards financial liberalization. At the textbook level, it is possible to find the distinction between internal and external liberalization. The internal liberalization entails the termination of the administrative control over the interest rates, leaving it to market mechanism, although this can actually never be achieved completely as long as there is the institution of the central bank, because what is a central bank? It is a massive intrusion into the market system. At the same time, one can also say that the abandonment of the concept of development banks is a part of the internal liberalization process. The rationale for this lies in the notion that selective credit allocation could distort the market process and thereby bring instability to the financial system. And lastly, the incorporation of the independent bank is one of the most important innovations in the pursuit of the internal financial liberalization. Now, this institution, with, I would say, inbuilt democratic deficit, is designed to be immune to the electoral process, so that it can engage in the construction of monetary system according to the neoclassical worldview. The independence of the central bank is represented in textbooks and other research papers as a firewall against the monetization of budget deficits. In most countries, it is also prohibited for central banks to buy government securities on the primary market. So it is important to notice that the policy of the independent central bank does not have to be coordinated with the overall macroeconomic policy. On the other hand, external liberalization, so this was internal, there is also the notion of external liberalization, and that amounts to liberalization of the capital account. So in other words, a country needs to introduce legislation that will ensure full mobility of money and capital. And of course, as a consequence, when you have trade deficit, it is compensated by surplus in capital account. Trade surpluses are of course neutralized by net capital exports and so on and so on, classical mechanism. So when we look at the last 2 decades of the economic history, we can see all of these changes in this region. That is all except the development and consolidation of capital markets. So for example, when you look at Croatia, you will find a quasi-Hilferding model of the economy in which banking sector has the advantage and in fact dominates over firms, households and the state. And I have this wonderful chart that I brought from Zagreb. If I can turn my computer on. Just to show you visually what this entails. No. Get on.
Aha, da, ugasio se, na standby se stavio.
We are experiencing some technical difficulties. Is there anything that works in Slovenia?
Wait 1 minute, he says politely.
I don't have a minute. I'm on a time.
Press enter key to remove this warning.
Okay. I don't know if you see this, but this is the graph of the bond issues in domestic market.
Na daljincu mogoče. Na
daljincu,
ja. Sam jaz zamaknem.
Ja.
Well, the point is that okay.
Možda lahko prilagodiš ovo...
Yeah, maybe if I lean a bit to the right.
Ne, resoluciju.
No, it's fine. The point is that the firms do not have the ability to use commercial paper or other type of securities, and they are in fact drawn to all kinds of loans from the banking sector. And so the banking sector has the ability to really negotiate the terms of trade, and this leaves, of course, the productive sector in a very peculiar position, kind of pressed between international competition and domestic banking sector. So, if you are familiar with Hilferding's work, you know that he described the early capitalist economy as an amalgam of the banking sector and of the usual business sector with banking sector, with the banks in the hegemonic position, as it were. So when you look at the Croatia, you get this the quasi-Hilferding model of the economy, as I said, and of course, nominally before the crisis hit, all post-socialist countries have been, at least in words, committed to the so-called export-led growth strategy. If you recall, the Irish model was in fact very popular in political discourse because the political elites and business elites also had seen the high rates of growth and low unemployment in Ireland, and they wanted to imitate the model without really understanding its internal mechanism. So inevitably the process of segregation of the core and periphery, especially after the introduction of the euro, converted the strategy of export-led growth into consumption-led growth, underpinned by rising indebtedness and imports. And this particular trajectory made the Eastern Europe as a region quite weak, and I would say also fragile to some extent. And this fact can be easily observed if we take a look at the channels through which the crisis has been transmitted to this region. As the economic conditions in Europe started to deteriorate, there was a sudden stop of credit flow to Eastern European countries. The subsidiaries of the foreign banks were now less willing to lend to companies, which of course led to a sharp increase in the number of bankruptcies for the private sector, and of course, as a consequence, it led to rising unemployment. At the same time, households were also under pressure in countries like Hungary or Croatia. The process of Eurozone led to a currency mismatch, so a situation in which debts are denominated in one currency, foreign currency, but wages and assets are denominated in local currency. And in this way, it is very easy for banks to transfer the risk of currency devaluation or appreciation of the foreign currency onto the households. Now, at this point, it is interesting to see the connection between the central banking practice, the financialization of the currency markets, and the financialization of households. Daniela Gabor, Romanian political economist, made an in-depth analysis of the financialization process in Eastern Europe. According to her, the process or the relation between central banks and money markets is a crucial site for understanding pre-crisis period. Securitization, a practice by which various forms of credit can be transformed into financial assets, has allowed for liquidity management to be shifted from the interbank market to the so-called repurchasing markets or repo markets, which of course means lending against collateral. Gabor points out that the ability to borrow from abroad shaped banks' participation on the interbank markets and its relationship with the central bank. That is, central banks in Eastern Europe provided a lucrative, as she put it, a lucrative carry trade outlet in the form of sterilization games. So the external financial liberalization of the capital account, made banks less dependent upon the conditions in the retail deposit segment, because they could now acquire funds from the parent bank or from the international interbank market. Sterilization, which was mentioned here, is a procedure aimed at neutralizing large capital inflows. That is, central banks need to intervene in the currency markets in order to keep the value of the currency under control, and of course to deal with liquidity excesses. Now, Gabor, in her analysis, uses as an indicator of the size of sterilization accumulated reserves, which point to the commitment of the Eastern European central banks to price stability, and first of all by keeping foreign exchange rate in check. Now, of course, the pressure on domestic currency arose from foreign direct investments and from capital inflows that were predominantly used for credit expansion, and in case of Croatia, tourism is also one of the factors. So in a classic scenario, of course, banks are in fact testing the willingness of the central bank to defend the currency peg, and the central banks, of course, informed, this is especially true in Croatia and and other former Yugoslav republics, the central banks informed by the monetarist policy are more than willing to respond to this request. So through sterilizations, banks have found a way to exploit cross-currency yield differentials. The result of this process was excess liquidity in many countries of the region, That is, the banking sector was allowed to build up reserves of liquidity, which in turn could be used for financing productive investment, but were in fact used for other things. The combination of the monetarist commitments of central banks and the eagerness of private banks to engage in free risk speculative activity created the conditions for the rise of strong and liquid, in fact consolidated banking sector, and weak and illiquid productive sector on the other side. Furthermore, the risk, or better to say, the risk preferences of the banks have shaped their operations, so that along with this carry trade activity, they were most heavily involved in household lending. This segment of the banking activity is dominated by origination and distribution of mortgages. So consequently, many post-socialist countries witnessed a rise in real estate prices, and in some cases we have seen asset bubbles emerging. As I pointed out earlier, in a system with high degree of Euroization, it was relatively easy to use for banks to use their position and, of course, political influence to transfer the risk of excessive lending to other parties, namely the working people. The share of domestic credit to the private sector as a percentage of GDP increased rapidly in pre-crisis period. It was at the end of 2008, it was 68% for Croatia, 71% for Bulgaria, I think 85% for Slovenia, and so on and so forth. Croatia is, in other words, a good example of all of the bad practices that have emerged during the last 2 decades. Now, I won't bother you because I cannot start PowerPoint presentation, but when you look at Croatia, it is like looking at Argentina before the crisis. All of the bad and really all of the elements of fragility are present, from the great problems in fiscal policy to really heavily indebted household sector, and really weak and underperforming, productive sector. Now, if you want to know more, you can ask me later about Croatian economy. I don't think that there's any point in showing this graphs, except this one that is not actually connected with Croatia primarily, but I like it very much. Why? Because I want to share this with you, because the EBRD bank has developed the so-called Transitional Index, which measures the progress in transition. Now, it appears that this progress in transition is negatively correlated with GDP in the crisis period. So the more you progressed in transition, the worse you were off in the period of crisis. So after 2008 to 2010. It's not very robust. You can see that regression analysis is 2.25, but Albania is an outlier, so if you remove this, I think you will get a much more robust result. So this is the external position of Croatian economy. You can see a constant problem in the current account, and really
we can't see. F5. F5 is the keyword. Thank you. Now we can see.
Okay. Yes. The external position of Croatian economy, as I said, great difficulties in the current account. You see that the major problem is the private sector debt. These are the Croatian banks, as explained in share of total assets. You can see a highly concentrated banking sector. So the first 4 banks Zagrebačka, Privredna, Erste und Steiermärkische and Raiffeisen are holding somewhat over 50, I think 60% of the total assets. So it is a highly concentrated banking sector, and the only bank here that is publicly or state-owned is at position 7. So all of these banks are foreign, have dominant foreign ownership, which is of course a good example of what has been going on in Europe throughout this period. And this is of course as the structure of the Croatian banking sector. Do look at claims on domestic non-banks, and you will see the rise in the claims on domestic households. Macroeconomic indicators, of course, another way of putting the same problem. Rise in household debt as a percent of GDP, quite rapid. It was 25% in 2003, now in 2009 it was 40%, and so on and so forth. Now, I will end this by trying to put forward some difficult questions with regard to what is to be done. Now, in my view, I think that the problem of introducing radical social policies in Eastern Europe is not much different from the problem of socialism in one country. And so it is up to the left to find inspiration in the past experiences of socialist countries on one hand, and I think in politics or policy inspired by Keynesian framework. But not Keynesian framework of this short-term fiscal stimulus, but Keynesian framework that implies socialization of instruments of production and euthanization of the rentier. I think if left is to find some kind of or to form some kind of alliance with Keynesian or Keynesian circle or Keynesian inspired politics, I think we need to first displace and really discharge the myth of Keynesianism that was introduced by neoclassical synthesis at the beginning of 1950s and onwards, that actually is it's a straw man. It is very easy to criticize that type of Keynesian policies that has only minor fiscal stimuluses in its arsenal of weapons. It is clear to me that there are internal differences between Marxian and Keynesian position, but on this level of really thinking about how to properly form or formulate radical social programs, I feel that these obstacles need to be overcome, and the best way to do it is by returning a bit in history and reading Keynes's books in original. And also we need to take into account a few lessons of the post-Keynesian economics. We know that the scare of rising interest rates and inflation through the use of fiscal stimulus is unwarranted under the assumption of some slack in the economy, and under the assumption that there is a sovereign currency which and sovereign monetary policy, and so that the given country can actually use its monetary and fiscal policies. Now this the first part is true for Eastern European countries. There is indeed some slack in the economy. However, the question is, what about the autonomous monetary policy? To what extent is this a possibility for left strategy today? And this is, of course, a difficult question. First of all, because we lack the proper analysis, and second of all, because we lack political influence. Nevertheless, I think this is the course that should be pursued, and that in that sense, some kind of theoretical dialogue between Keynesian and Marxian position is not only possible, but is in fact necessary. Thank you. And just under an hour.
Thank you, Mislav. Next up is, we have a short break or we can talk? Okay, next up is Marko Kostanić.
This is the break of half an hour break.
Half an hour break.
Half an hour break.
Yeah,
Do you know the schedule?
I think we should democratically vote.
Okay,
let's have a discussion now.
Discussion and break and then
Let's have a break / discussion.
Okay, let's have discussion, then break, then another discussion, then another break. No, I'm joking. Let's have discussion.
Okay, are there any questions? Please.
A question for Mislav. What did you mean by comparing the Eastern European question vis-à-vis the left strategy with the problem of socialism in one country?
Well, the constraints are basically the same. We have, every small and open economy has a limited amount of resources. So that means that you have some kind of constraints in conducting economic and other policies. And if you want to pursue the pathway of radical social programs in education, in health services and so on, you are actually faced with the same constraints that, for example, former Yugoslavia was faced when it tried to introduce market socialism. Now, these two things are not the same. So, full-blown socialist strategy is different from Keynesian-inspired radical social programs. But at this point, I think that the constraints are very, very similar. So we can, so the left today can find inspiration in market socialism of former Yugoslavia, and or also in some sort of experimentation with Keynesianism. We can actually experiment to see how far it actually goes in terms of economic and other policies. How radical can Keynesianism really get? I think that is the proper question. Yeah.
Is that the question simply because you don't think that macroeconomic measures can be applied consistently with Marxism, or simply because you like Keynesianism?
What do I think that?
Is your view formed based on that you don't think that with Marxian economic framework we can have a consistent macroeconomic view which we can then policy apply, or you simply
No, I wasn't thinking about that at all. First of all, I was thinking about the weakness of the left today. And so, of course, if you put it in a hierarchical mode, the radical social policies of Keynesian type would be somewhere here at some middle point, and introduction of socialist economy would be somewhere up here. So
it's just modesty based on resources.
Well, it's modesty based on the fact that, I mean, when you look at the political and economic situation and what has been going on for the last 2 decades, we should be modest. We should be at least at this first level, you know, of countering the neoliberalism in its current austerity form.
Katarina?
Yes, first of all, I must say that I'm 100% in agreement with both reports, and so I have lots of comments and questions to raise, and I must say that I hope, it's only 1 minute to say, I hope that we will have collaboration and exchange, because both reports needs lots of discussion. So I have some question of both of them. First on the first one, I think we should know that about what is being introduced. You speak of this pact, which is a terrible social new social offensive and class offensive. I only wanted to raise one question about the way they will establish what means structural deficit in the new rules that they want to introduce, and only to tell you that there was an open conflict with the Danish central bank in the way to analyze what do you consider as structural or not structural. For instance, education, health, are they long-term
cyclical deficits,
investment that you should not take into account in those structural deficit or not? And there is an amount of debate around that. The second point is on the general evaluation of, you said that there is a combination of colonial relationship between core countries and peripheral countries and class dimensions. On the first aspect, well, I must say that I am involved in specific analysis of East European transformation, and inside the anti-globalization movement in attack and so on. I am involved in a group of let's say research or militant research with some Hungarians also and so on question of core peripheral relationship within the Union. So we will have to collaborate on this issue. But I think the analysis is correct. There is a de facto, and what I said yesterday also, de facto dominant power, especially France and Germany, let's say, and the banking system behind that. And when you look at the domination of the debt structure by the French and German banks, but I also raised yesterday in too short time the contradiction within European Union of that de facto neo-colonial kind of relationship. I think it's completely not only illegal, illegitimate, but confronted with strong resistance possible. And when you are speaking of what to do, I think this issue is important. In the countries and the people who voted to enter the Union didn't vote to enter a colonial kind of structure. They wanted and the negotiation, institutional negotiation on the voting powers in the Union for Spain and Poland, for Germany, and is not based on the GDP strength. So there is a de facto core peripheral relationship, but it is not legitimate, and there are political and institutional elements to resist to this, asking for egalitarian relationships within the Union. So, secondly, if you look at Germany, the German kind of growth has been based on a decrease of wages of German workers, which is the most important that occurred in the whole European Union. The decrease of German wages was the highest decrease. So that is to say that there is a real social interest for German workers, French workers and the others to collaborate in the changing of the relationship within the Union, because they are confronted the very same kind of social programs and so on. Then the last point I wanted to raise is about the second report. First, I don't know if Luca, is he here? No, he's out. I sent to Luca an article in English, which is a chapter I wrote for a book. Yes, Luca is back. I sent you an article in English on East European, confronted to the crisis, East European countries. Was it possible to make copies, or will it be possible to make it circular?
Of course.
Anyway, I wanted to, it's needed to be circular, because it's close to what you said. That is, it's a chapter of the book which is in English on the crisis, on anti-capitalist analysis of it, and the chapter is concentrated on East European dimensions of the crisis, which I didn't dealt with yesterday, and you dealt with. And the banking transformation is one of the aspects, and the foreign direct investment kind of policy is, of course, important there. But on that point, I wanted to raise two questions. First, in Slovenia, especially, we are here. Jose Mensinger precisely developed opposite analysis, not orthodox analysis, and I am involved in the same kind of European economist alternative regroupment, where Mensinger is, where he developed concrete analysis on the fact that the foreign direct investment doesn't bring growth, but they go where there is growth. It's just the opposite. And increase inequalities, regional inequalities, and so on and so forth. And the choice which have been made under social pressure of trade union specificity in Slovenia, and a specific relationship of forces, combination in Slovenia, permits us to see that the, at least up to the integration of Slovenia within the Union, in the 90s at least, the economic evolution was completely different from the other Eastern European countries. Both because the banking system at that time was dominated by the state and not privatization. And second, because the orientation to attract foreign direct investment was not a priority. So there was an orientation, and it's very important in the discussion to see how it was under the pressure of the European Commission and the World Bank and the IMF and so on to change all that. And Mensinger, and I quoted this in my article also, stressed the fact that the privatization of the banks in Slovenia occurred just before the international banking crisis. So in the very bad, so that's one point. And the last point I wanted to say, I don't want to be too long, so the debate you raised at the end on the question of Keynes and Marx. I'm also involved as an economist in the history of economic thinking. So there is both theoretical aspect and political issues, like you said. It is a question of alliances. Right. And of course there are two kind of wings among Keynesians. The neoclassical, the alliance with neoclassicals, and the alliance with Marxists. And this is an issue. And I agree that going back to the real Keynesian orientation, I mean, you can both, and I have also to send you some comments on that more in the lengthy. There are absolutely, on theoretical aspect, common aspect with Marx, and the question of money, right, which refused the dichotomic approach of liberals. The question of market failures and the incapacity of any market, be it so-called socialist market or capitalist one, to solve the issue of full employment and stabilize any kind of growth. But then the real problem with Keynesian analysis is which is not a problem as such. I mean, it's the need of further debates and choices. The question of social relationship and ownership, and the question of the statute of the workers, and the kind of capitalist crisis we are confronted to means that we cannot accept only marginal answers of the neoclassical Keynesian kind, but more fundamental answers. But those more fundamental answers are to deal with ownership and with the statute of workers. That's why there are alliance and conflicting aspects with Keynesians on those issues, and they have to choose also. But the other element is at what territorial level could you implement a kind of neo-Keynesian Marxist answer. And I do believe the European level and not the national level is the adequate level, territorial, political and social level. And then it raises the question of trade unions, European trade unions, and social resistance at European level. So initiative at the European levels, like against the central bank in the middle of May. So, yeah.
Just a short comment. I agree with you. The wider political space would be more suited for the implementation of any kind of radical social politics. And in fact, the late Croatian economist Branko Horvat used to advocate the so-called Balkan Union. And of course, when you mention Balkan unions among the leftists, everybody gets excited. But the fact of it's true. But the fact of the matter,
Socialist Balkan Union.
But the fact of the matter is that we have not thought through what is the internal mechanism. This is what we need to think about. So it is easy to nominally say, "Oh, I'm against this type of narrow-minded neoclassical policy on a national level." But it is much more difficult to really establish an economic program, fully developed, fully fledged economic program that will actually, on one hand, enable us to pursue these policies, and on the other hand, protect us within this, let's say, Balkan Union from the influences of the international financial market. We must not make the same mistakes that Yugoslavia made back in the 1970s and 1980s. Okay. So that was my point, and I agree with basically your comments.
Well, if I can step in, now I realize that I really gave a speech, not really an analysis. But
well, better now than never.
It's fine. Luckily, we like you.
I said it's 11 in the morning. It's better to charge in with some rhetoric exaltation and to wake all up. So I found myself.
Now the analysis.
I found myself in that flow, and I just couldn't get out of it. But regarding your observation on workers coordination and cooperations among the European countries, I must disagree. I think it's impossible. It's impossible for French workers, German workers, Greek workers to coordinate and cooperate their resistance through European Union to capitalist class. The whole emergence of the European Union was exactly invented to prevent this kind of cooperation and coordination. Now the time has come for workers and to face this collision with the capitalist class, and it will be, however it sounds, it will be more easier through national entities than through European Union. European Union, there are no institutions for workers to organize themselves across Europe. So I just think that the resistance would be easier through national entity. And Keynesian proposal that Varoufakis is giving to European elites, it's good only in the sense that it is postponing this clash. It gives working class time to on national level to strengthen themselves against this clash which will occur so in next 5 or 10 years.
Any more questions?
Steve.
I wanted just to add something to this, because I think we will be discussing these issues throughout these next days. And one thing I think one should really avoid is a false dichotomy between the European level and the national level. Because these are not opposites, it's a question of articulation. You can never abandon local struggles for some superior level because it doesn't exist in itself. It's a question of articulation of local struggles. And that refrains the whole question of nation state or post-nation state. For one, the European Union is not a post-nationalist entity. The whole Eurobonds debate has shown that the core countries insist on debt to remain within national frameworks, for one, so the elites do not consider it a post-nationalist project. And the other aspect, of course, is the nation state. There is a division of labor between the European and the national levels. It is still the nation state which is basically disciplining its labor force, which is responsible for ensuring a certain level of social reproduction and so forth and so forth. And at the same time, all of the past struggles of the exploited and subaltern classes have to some extent been so the relative successes have been institutionalized in one way or another in certain institutions which exist only at the national state level. There is no equivalent to these, for example, so there is no European, how you call it, pregovori sindikata I države. Social dialogue. Well, there is
no social dialogue in Europe.
There is no debate between European capital and European unions. So that is that is fractured always on the national level. So I think it's a question of articulation of these levels, and the left shouldn't be so naive to abandon the instruments which are basically to some extent the result of past social struggles, and they are inscribed in the nation-state form, whether we like it or not. And we have to find a way to use them and articulate them, and then that would be, I guess, a plausible.
Yes, I don't want to. I agree that probably it will be discussed in the other sessions too. I completely agree with you. That's the matter. When I was speaking of what territorial level was too short, it was only on the point of view, not on the question of class struggle, political struggle, but at the level of budget.
Yeah, on the level of economic resources.
This is an element. I mean, and when I speak budget, is not the good term. I mean, there should be social funds, investment funds at European level, for instance, transport, public transport, question of education and so on, in order to both oppose the competition and have a real possibility of European projects at that level. But as far as the question of political struggle, trade union struggle, and even there is something to be built. You say it's easier at the national levels. Yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, because it seems closer and there are traditions, and we absolutely must not leave them. We must build the relationship of forces at from the local, but I must say from the local to the planet, because there are some issues, environment and some issues of north-south, energy, agriculture, which are also to be dealt at an international level with some kind of articulation. But at least at the continental level, there must be articulation between the national and the continental. Fiscal issues, you must resist competition, wage policy, you must resist competition. And if you are only at the national level, you very rapidly come into competition and to try and reinforce your national position. So you have to combine aspects.
Okay. Any replies or other comments?
I just had a question for Mislav. How do you frame this current crisis, especially in the Eastern European context and the level of the Eastern Europe? I mean, if I understand you correctly, you frame it as a crisis of liquidity, or at least as a crisis of a credit squeeze.
It is one aspect of it. No, well, what is true for Eastern European states is that they were weak before the crisis. They had a build-up of fragility before the crisis actually emerged. And what this crisis did is expose the weaknesses of these economies. And this is what I try to describe in a historical manner. So for Eastern European countries, crises have all kinds of aspects. I like to talk about the crisis of the household because this aspect of the crisis was least mentioned in media and in debates as well. So yeah, it would be of course wrong to say it is just credit crunch because it's so much more. It is the inability of these economies to really pursue any kind of growth on one hand, and to an inability of them to implement any kind of decent social policies on the other hand. Why? Because at one hand you have fiscal problems, and with these fiscal problems, and which are of course imposed from the outside by financial markets and international financial institutions, you have to face international competition. So the position of Eastern European countries is somewhat similar to the periphery in the Eurozone. The mechanism seems to be quite similar. Of course, the main difference here is that the periphery in the Eurozone is too important to be left alone. So when the crisis erupted in Greece or Portugal, all hell broke loose. But when Hungary went under, nobody even talked about it. Okay. So this is the main difference, I think.